Good morning, scholars, or good afternoon, whatever time of day it is that you're watching this video. I'm going to be reading Chapter 3 in our social studies book, The Articles of Confederation. And, of course, before we start, I want to give each of you a big hug. Ooh, I miss you guys. Ooh, this is ridiculous not being able to see your face for the rest of the year. But needless to say, here we go, okay? Page 20. It starts with the section Meeting in Philadelphia. The Second Continental Congress was a meeting of delegates from all the colonies. And, of course, the vocab for delegate means a representative. So if you are a delegate for somebody, you are representing a bunch of people. Like when you come to school, you're the delegate for your family, right? I see you, and I assume that everybody in your family acts the way you do or behaves the way you do or has the same beliefs as you, right? That's what a delegate is. And it took place, back to the reading, in Philadelphia in 1775. So this is before the whole American Revolution, before the Declaration of Independence, because that was signed in 1776, right? Anyway, so those delegates had all been called together to decide what to do about the latest acts of the British government against the colonists' liberties. All right, so let's go to page 21. It says, the Second Continental Congress first met in Philadelphia in May 1775, just weeks after the Battle of Lexington and Concord and the start of the American Revolution. So like I said, they first met before the Revolution, or around the time that these battles were happening, the Revolution really got its start. Page 22 says, if anybody had told these delegates that they would still be meeting 2 years later, few of them would have believed it. But in 1777, there they were. And now they weren't just discussing protests against Parliament. They were in charge of a war for independence. And they would continue meeting for 4 more years, still running the war. So they met for 4 years just to run the war. But that wasn't the only thing they did. It says the Second Continental Congress was doing something else as well. It was trying to agree on a government for the new United States of America. Most members of Congress agreed that the new nation needed some kind of central government and a government for the whole nation, right? They wanted a federal kind of government. However, every time they began to consider what kind of government, they ran into a little problem. The problem was they had a fear of a central government with too much power. They're fighting a war against Britain because it had too much power, and they didn't want to create a whole new government that had too much power over the people. So they didn't want to get stuck in the same kind of government. In 1777, back to the paper, it says the Congress voted to approve a plan for a new central government. The plan was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was sent to the states for approval. So the vocab word there, a confederation, is a group of states joined together by a formal agreement. So they had all these 13 colonies at the time, and they brought them together for this confederation, and they called it the Articles of Confederation. Now, after being debated in each state, so this was 1777, they created the Articles of Confederation, and then they had to send these Articles of Confederation to each of the states so they could be debated. So after being debated in each state, it finally went into effect 4 years later in 1781. So the Articles of Confederation, while they may have they may have been approved by the Second Continental Congress in 1777, they weren't approved by the states until 1781, 4 years later. And that was when Maryland became the last state to approve it. The Articles of Confederation were very different from the constitutions the states had adopted for themselves. So remember in the last chapter we talked about each state had their own constitution. Well, this Articles of Confederation was a whole nother thing. And like the state constitutions, the articles created a law-making body. So they set aside and they said, okay, well, this body, this is the one that makes the laws. And they called this Congress. That's where the similarities ended. So remember when we had talked about the states' constitutions, they had a Congress which made the state laws, right? Well, federal government did the same thing with the Articles of Confederation, and they made a Congress for making the laws for the United States of America. The people didn't elect the members of Congress, however. That's the members of Congress to the federal government. The way they elected their state legislatures, because remember, state legislatures, according to their state constitutions, were elected by the people, and they had 1-year term limits and so forth. Well, that's not the way it worked for Congress in the federal government. Members of Congress were appointed by the states. So the people in each state, they appointed people. Didn't mean that they were voted. They just meant that they were appointed. In fact, the people of the United States had no direct connection with this new central government at all. You see, the new government didn't represent the people. It represented the states. So the new government had to do with, represented each individual state, but not the people necessarily in those states. So let's go back to this. So you see, the new government didn't represent the people, it represented the states, and the states had established their own political independence. You'll see the importance of that difference in just a little bit, according to what this says, all right? There was another important difference between the Articles of Confederation and the state constitutions. State constitutions gave their legislature power to do a great many things. So the constitutions in each state, they gave their legislature power to do different things. Remember, we talked about they could charge taxes, they could build schools, that sort of thing. But the Articles of Confederation, though they gave Congress power to do very, very few things, all right? So the Articles of Confederation didn't give Congress, for the federal government, any power. These were some of the main powers, though. Congress could declare war and make peace. You already have, and if you look on this paper here, this right here tells you what some of the powers of the central government under the Articles of Confederation. I'm just going to go ahead and read through them, okay? So Congress could declare and make peace, make war and peace. They could create an army and a navy. They could send representatives to foreign countries. They could borrow money, so they could borrow money from other countries or banks or whatever for the federal government. They could establish a system of weights and measures. That was important because if they didn't have that, somebody could say, well, this thing that I'm weighing and want to sell to you weighs this. But if it wasn't an established thing, anyway, that's a whole other thing. They could establish post offices, and they could print money. So that's what the Articles of Confederation gave power to the federal government. So back to reading on page 23. It said you could hardly have one state, on page 24, making peace while the others continue to fight against Great Britain. So that was why they said that the Articles of Confederation had the power to make war and peace, because if Virginia said, oh, we make peace with Britain, but then Pennsylvania was like, no, we don't want to, then you've got two states in the same country fighting one fighting another country, the other not. And so they wanted to give the federal government that power, not the states. Anyway, back to the page 24. So the Congress can make treaties and alliances with other nations. And let's look at the vocab for those two words. A treaty is a formal agreement between two or more groups, especially countries. So it's the two countries sitting down and saying, okay, let's not fight anymore. Let's agree to do this. And if we agree to do this, then we won't have to fight. An alliance, however, is a partnership of different countries, organizations, or people who work together, who agree to work together. So an alliance is, for instance, when we went to war against Britain in the American Revolution, we formed an alliance with France because France didn't want Britain. They were fighting against Britain anyway, so they said, hey, let's partner up with these guys. We'll agree to do this and work together to beat Britain. So that's what an alliance is. It could, back to the reading on page 24. So it could settle arguments between the states about their boundaries, about where one state's land ended and another's began. So that was something the federal government could do. It could say, Pennsylvania, these are your borders. Virginia, these are your borders. And Maine, whoever, it had that power to do that. It could borrow money, set up a postal system, and create currency or a money system. That was about it. That's all the Articles of Confederation for the federal government was giving it power to do. To make sure the Congress did not try to do more than it was supposed to, the Articles of Confederation added this. Said unless the articles specifically gave a power to the new Congress, Congress did not have it. So Congress couldn't be like, well, you didn't say in the Articles of Confederation that we could not do this, so we're going to do it. They had to it had to be specifically said in the Articles of Confederation, the state can do this. All right, so that wraps up the section in this chapter that's titled Meeting in Philadelphia. So if you answer your questions on your worksheet, for that section. You can pause it right here and go back and answer those questions. If you need to reread the text, you could do so, or you could like rewind the video and go that anyway. But anyway, so I'm gonna pause it right there for just a second. And yeah, okay, there. All right, so now we're gonna read Too Little Power, which is the next section in this chapter. And it has a whole nother set of questions, okay? So we're on page 24 again in the middle. Too little power. How did the Articles of Confederation work out in practice? Unfortunately, not very well. There were many reasons why. For one thing, each state, whether large or small, had only one vote in Congress. That meant that little Rhode Island, with a population of 68,000, had the same vote as Virginia, which had more than 10 times as many people. Some of the larger states became frustrated and felt this voting agreement was unfair. So the larger states got offended that they didn't have as much power or as much more voting rights in Congress, the federal Congress, than these little states, because they had more people to represent, so it didn't make sense to them, and they got angry about that, which is understandable. Another problem was that Congress was always broke. Sorry, that didn't make sense. Another problem was that Congress was always broke. They got no money. During the war, the Continental Congress had borrowed from other countries. So during the American Revolution, Continental Congress had borrowed from other countries to help fund their war, right? And they borrowed this money and from other countries and from individual Americans to buy supplies and pay the army. With the war over, it was time to start paying the money back, because most people are like, hey, you won. Where'd my money back? Come on. Well, right now, you're probably thinking, why didn't Congress just pass some laws to collect taxes? After all, that's what the state governments did, right? Well, the reason is that the Articles of Confederation did not allow Congress to tax. So that was not one of the powers that the Articles of Confederation gave to the federal government. And only the state government could do that. So there was that problem about a strong central government again. They didn't want a strong central government, so they didn't give them that power to tax people and raise money. Then how is Congress supposed to get the money? So if we continue reading on page 25, it says all it could do was tell the states how much money was needed and then ask each one to contribute its fair share. If they did, fine. If they didn't, then the central government had no power to make them contribute. Not surprisingly, perhaps most didn't. For every $100 Congress asked for, the state contributed just $5. You can't pay off many debts that way. So Congress had said, all right, so we can't do taxes, so we're going to tell the state governments, you need to provide to us, because the state governments, you guys can get taxes, so you need to pay the federal government, let's say, like I said, $100. You need to pay us $100 so we can start paying these debts off. Well, the federal government had no power to, if the state government decided not to pay it, because they were kind of like, pay as much as you can. You know, we really can't tell you how much to pay us, but we'd like this much. And just like anybody else, if I said, well, I'd like you to give me $100. Can you give me $100? And you just gave me $5. Well, I have no power to make you give me $100. You just gave me $5 because that's what you wanted to give me, and you don't want to give me any more, right? Well, that's kind of what was happening. This federal government had no power to get that money from the states. Even when it became clear, I'm reading back here again, even when it became clear that the central government had to have at least some power to raise money, there was not much that could be done about it. That's because of another weakness of the Articles of Confederation. To amend or change this Constitution, all 13 states had to give their agreement. So in order for something in the Articles of Confederation to be changed or amended or fixed or taken out, all 13 states had to be like, yes, we agree. And that was hard to do, okay? So twice, those who favored the idea tried to amend the Articles to allow Congress to tax. And each time, 12 states said yes, but one state refused. So the amendment would fail. And that's all it took was one state going, no, we don't want that. And all of them would be like, ah. You know how frustrating that is? Yeah. That's like when we want to play a game in class and everybody wants to do this except for that one person, right? Anyway, back to the reading. While the Articles of Confederation gave Congress the power to declare war, Congress had no power to raise an army. So the Articles of Confederation said, hey, federal government, you can declare war against whoever it is you want to declare war. But we're not going to let you raise an army. You don't have that power. So it could ask each state to contribute its fair share of men, but again, it was up to each state to decide whether it would do so. This was a big problem for when farmers revolted in Massachusetts in 1786 in Shays' Rebellion. So you got the federal government, and they can go to war with whoever they want to, right? But they can't raise an army. Well, if we go to page 26, there's a picture there. It says Shays' Rebellion was an armed revolt against what were considered to be unfair taxes and harsh economic conditions. The governor had to organize a military group to stop the rebels. So the state government had to get a military, an army involved, and the federal government couldn't do anything about it. So let's continue reading on page 26. It says, there were other problems too. The government of the United States of America had no one at its head. There was nobody that was the leader, per se. After their experience with the king, Americans decided against giving power to any single person. Each year, Congress elected one of its members to be president of the Congress, but that wasn't the same thing as being head of the whole government. It was just a nice title with no real power, okay? So there, again, nobody, if you don't have one person in charge, like at school, Mrs. Messer, she's the person that's in charge. She is at the top of the food chain, right? And she's the one that is in charge, the figurehead of the school. Now, if we didn't have that, we just had all the teachers who were the heads of the school. Like, we could be like, okay, I'm going to vote for Coach Dahl is going to be the head of the school. That'd be a little crazy. But anyway, don't tell her. Anyway, so you could do that, but then, maybe the person who's in charge of kindergarten wouldn't like that, or the person, so you got to have one person in charge. That makes sense, right? So let's continue reading on page 27 to wrap up this chapter. It says, with such a weak central government, states often did whatever they wanted. So these state governments were like, the federal government, they can't do anything. We're going to do whatever we want. And even though they weren't supposed to, they did that. For example, the Articles of Confederation said that Congress had the right to raise a navy, but 9 states went ahead and had navies of their own. So that Congress was trying to have a federal navy, just one navy, and then you had these 9 little states who were like, hey, we got our own navy. We got our own navy. No, we got our own navy. And again, that's just mass kind of confusion, right? So the central government seemed so unimportant that state legislatures took their time electing delegates to Congress. So again, Congress is like, we need states to send delegates to us to be a part of our Congress to help us make these decisions. And state delegates or states were like, we don't need to send anybody. You guys don't have any kind of power whatsoever. So what does it matter? So the delegates took even more time getting to its meetings, and some didn't even bother to show up. Sorry, I'm outside. My allergies. Anyway, it's not the Rona. Americans have been understandably afraid of creating a central government with too much power, but after 6 years under the Articles of Confederation, many people believed they had created one with not enough. So that was the biggest problem in this whole Articles of Confederation, is by the end, people realized we didn't want a strong central government, but now we've created one that doesn't have any power and doesn't even have enough power to do so. So that's a problem. And that's where we're going to leave this chapter, okay? So I want you to turn me off. You can always go back and re-listen to this. But I want you to go answer those questions that go along with this chapter, all right? I'll see you in the next video with the next chapter. Bye-bye.